Welcome to this series on as it relates to podcasting. This is going to be such a good one because we are diving into an entire month of understanding more of the SEO side and more of the analytics side with my guest, Anna. She also goes by the podcast space, so if you recognize her handle there, that is who she is. Today, we're talking about mastering your podcasting mindset. And in this episode, we're discussing the mindset that's required for podcasting success. We're tackling common concerns of always needing more downloads. I don't know if you feel that way, but it's something that is very common to sort of benchmark your downloads against somebody else's. So we're talking about that today. And we're also emphasizing the value of progress and authenticity over those raw numbers. I do think it's important to know where you're at in the space and understand your downloads and the numbers, but we're talking about in this series, what do they actually mean and how can you leverage those to ultimately convert your show in a way that you want to with your ideal listener. So my guest, Anna, today is an incredible human being. She is the founder and CEO of the podcast space and is a multilingual award-winning professional with experience in global podcasting and a heart for impact-driven entrepreneurs. Anna's superpower is the ability to help clients identify a podcast idea that accelerates their business or professional goals, establishes trust with their ideal customer, and avoids content creator overwhelm. Anna and her team have helped more than 40 professionals and entrepreneurs launch and improve their podcast. And each month, they help thousands more through their consulting, online courses, and through the official podcast. Today's episode is going to be a good one. Let's get into our conversation. And if you have any questions, you know to reach out to us at the links below. Anna, welcome to As It Relates to Podcasting. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm so thrilled to be here. I feel like this has been long overdue, and we're both busy people as heck. So can I curse? Is heck?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
all right.
you absolutely
Perfect.
can. It wouldn't be my podcast if you couldn't.
All right. All right. Well, I know my bearings now. But yeah, I'm so excited to be here on your show. Thank you.
Thank you. I love having other women creators on this podcast. And the reason why is because I feel like this space can sometimes be very male dominated. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's just something really nice about getting to sit down with someone who maybe has been through some of the same struggles and some of the different, challenges, and we kind of just get each other. And I feel like you and I get each other on a very soul level as well.
Yes.
So
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I feel like I normally joke around where like I never had a female client come to me and be like, all right, let's do this podcast. And every male client never came to me with like, I'm not sure, I'm like doubting myself. Like it's always like such a really interesting energy. So I totally get what you're saying.
I love that. And it actually kind of plays into what we're talking about in this episode today. So we're doing 4 episodes and we're going to talk a lot about the back end and analytics and getting into like the nitty gritty and like how to plan your podcast so that you can take breaks and that kind of stuff. But before we get into that, I always like to start these series off with more of a mindset component because I think that it's something that's often overlooked. And I think a lot of creators get into this rabbit hole and this like roller coaster of I have to do this much content. I have to always be creating. I have to always be growing. And if I don't have 1 million downloads, I'm a failure. If I haven't, hit 5,000 downloads on one episode on my first week of being live, then my podcast has failed. And there's so many stories and there's a lot of comparison too. I see this with my clients all the time of like, well, they'll send me other podcasts and it's like, well, so and so, like, look how many downloads they have and they've only been live for like 5 weeks. And it's this whole mindset game. So I really want to dive into that today. So let's start with I should have more downloads. Thoughts? Concerns?
Oh my God. If I only had $1 every time I get that question.
We'd be multimillionaires.
Oh my gosh,
Yes.
yes. Very much so. I would feel like in, a fancy place. So yes, downloads. I get this question a lot as well because that's almost like because podcasting can be used in so many different ways because people can, like do a structure on the show like that is looking different to everyone. It feels like the numbers are like that safe zone, right? Like we all want numbers. And I mean, to me, like podcasting is not about downloads. Of course, if you want to use downloads, the only thing that I'll say is like, if you're using the downloads to kind of like be the starting point of your understanding of, you know, how many people you're touching with your message and progress, instead of looking at the absolute like 2 is bad, you know,
Yeah.
400 is good, like take that with a grain of salt. Is just thinking,
Yeah.
and this is my best recommendation. If you're working from home, how many people do you normally talk to on a daily basis? You're probably going to tell me like maybe one, two. Like if we're talking about like new leads, think about the amount of conversations you would have to have non-stop to say, let's say have 10 downloads a day, right? Like that would be 10 conversations, but you would repeat yourself constantly.
Yeah.
So does 10 downloads now sound better when you're like, I do not want to have 10 conversations every single day, right? So it's
About the
just,
same thing.
yeah, like look at the comparison of like, what does this mean in, you know, like when there was no internet? You had no
Hmm.
choice, right? Like have those conversations. Today we have the capacity. So looking at the number and thinking about like, without, you know, taking the fact that like there's people that have thousands of downloads, sure. But like, do you have 10,000 friends? Do you have 100 friends? Do you have, it's, everything's by comparison. There's people that know a lot of people, there's people that don't know that many people. It all changes depending on who you are and your circumstances. So that's how I would look
Hmm.
at it.
I like that reframe. And I think, too, one other way that I like to look at this is if you were speaking on a stage and you have a room of 100 people, or a room of 200 people, or a room of 300 people, or 50 people, or 10 people, or 20 people, that's a significant deal. Like, you would be excited and empowered and looking forward to speaking to that room of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100, 400, 1,000 people. And I think that when we look at numbers, sometimes we forget that like those numbers represent people. They represent people who are excited to learn from you and excited to hear from you and excited to connect with you. And I think it can be almost like a disservice to your own self to not realize that and to like honor that. And I feel like I have to sometimes remind myself that too. If I have an episode and I'm like, oh, I really thought that would do like way better than it did, quote unquote, way better. But it's kind of like, who's deciding what good is for you, right? It's kind of like this idea of like success. It's like success can be whatever it is that you define it, and everyone has a different definition. And so I think that the challenge when it comes to looking at growth and developing your mindset around growth is you're also at the same time competing with this idea in your mind of what success means to you. What do you think?
Yeah, yep, exactly. Because again, look at, realistically, there's small businesses, medium businesses, large businesses, and the capacity that each one has is different. So I always say, if you've done everything right and your content strategy aligns with your business goals, if you had suddenly 100 emails on your inbox from people, from warm leads, you would freak out, right?
Mm-hmm.
For most people, they do not have the capacity to respond to that level of like interest flood into their inbox, into their business, right? So you can have 10 listeners that actually are action takers, or you can have 1,000 listeners of people who
Mm-hmm.
are absolutely just consuming your free content and never do business with you, never reach out, never want to know more of what you're doing, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
understanding as well, like, what do these mean, but also what could it mean for them to engage with you or not? I know so many people who have podcasts that became viral and they're like, all right, I'm gonna burn this to the ground because I got bored, because their goals were not aligned, because suddenly they're like feeling the pressure
Mm-hmm.
to, I'd say probably to like perform, right? They never wanted that thing to go as big because they lose control of the reach. And so it really depends of like, what do you want? If you want an intimate like relationship with your listener, if you suddenly had to engage with 1,000 people out of the blue, like you probably don't want that. So I think that it's
Mm-hmm.
important to understand like what could happen if, you know, you're steadily growing, you have the capacity to respond, but if you suddenly go viral, I know so many creators that got freaked out and shut down their business. And I was like, this
Yeah,
actually happens because they were like, oh my God, I don't want the spotlight too fast. Right. So I think that that's
exactly.
important to understand. Like, what is your capacity as a creator to respond to a sudden surge in popularity? And that's when people are like, oh, you know what? Actually, I'm okay with, growing things a bit slower. So did I answer your question? I feel like I went just like in a
Mm-hmm.
little bit around, but
No, I love it. I love it so much. I like these to be conversations, and I like when they're fluid like this because it brings up so many valid points. The first thing that I want to pull on is this idea of, okay, let's say you have 1,000 downloads per episode. If you have that, I'm really happy for you. Like, that's amazing. I love that. What does the 1,000 downloads mean to you? What are you planning on doing with that? Is it, you're trying to rank the charts and become, top 1%, 5%, 10%, 100, whatever podcaster? That's fine. That's great too. Like, I love that. I think you just have to define like what your goals are and what you're working towards, right? Because if you're doing a podcast that's just for fun, first of all, and you're just like shooting the shit with your friends, like maybe it's a co-hosted thing. What is the goal of the show, right? Are you just having a conversation for entertainment's sake and you just want to shed light on a topic? Or is it a podcast that's educational in style? Or is it something that's bringing leads back into your business, right? Like, you want to make sure that you understand what the goal is of your show. And then I think from there too, the number of downloads, honestly, it doesn't really matter based off of it just depends on what your goals are. So if your goals are to bring new leads into your business and your podcast is bringing you, I don't know, like 10 really key leads every single year, even like that are like really, really, really strong leads that are paying all of your bills for like years and years to come and all of the above, or selling out your programs or supporting your book launches. I think that's really important to remember. And then on the flip side of that, if your goal is to do more, sponsorship based stuff, which is really cool too, how engaged is your audience, right? That's what, like you're saying, is like the engagement of your audience is so crucial, because you can have 1,000 listeners, but if none of them are buying, that's not a good partnership with that brand. And that brand probably won't want to work with you again, you know?
yes, yes. And let me add to that another thing, which is one big issue that I see is clients starting a podcast to be like a passion project, but then
Mm,
they put it to the standards of like, I should be monetizing. And I was like, well, but that's a completely different strategy if you
yeah.
want to monetize. And people seem to think that I can do this as a hobby and look at it from perspective of monetizing, because they're not willing to commit to the things that sometimes either some trade-offs. It doesn't mean they need to trade off a lot, but sometimes there are some trade-offs. But then people recall, I'm like, no, but this is my fun thing. And so you have to have clarity, and that's, I think, like where the numbers come in, because people have no clarity anywhere else, and so the numbers are like the absolute thing, the one metric that they're like, I know numbers, I can like understand numbers. And so people look at numbers as in like the only measurable, quantifiable thing. So if you
Yeah.
don't quantify, you know, how many engagements you want to have every, I know people that like they couldn't work in the industry they wanted, but they started a podcast as a way to like liaise and network with people who work in that industry, to just get to be a part of that industry somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be that. Or to me, like, I'm an extrovert, and so I love talking to people, but I know a lot of introverts who are like, God forbid, I want to hop on a sales call. I do not want. So they use the podcast as a way to do the work for them. Like, think about like if you don't like hopping on sales call, or at least you don't want to hop on as many, you can be walking your dog, you can be swimming, you can be spending time with your family, and the podcast is running for you in the background. So like, what a joy
Mm-hmm.
to just like live your life while the podcast is doing everything else for you. For a lot of people, that is what success looks like. So they don't really care
Mm-hmm.
about the downloads as much. It's like, well, I had 3 downloads today, means that I didn't have to have 3 conversations. Yeehaw. So
It's true. And it's true. And then you can have like 3 more leads into your business. You can have 3 more sales into whatever you're doing. You can have, that 3 downloads could push you into the million downloads so far. You know what I mean? I think it's like the numbers game is such a challenging game to play because, okay, let me know what you think about this. Because in my entire series with our friend Lloyd, we talked about this. And I'll link them in the show notes as well, so you can go and listen to them if you want, but you can just go and listen to that whole series. It was like not the one that just went, but the one before that. Anyways, okay, we were talking about this idea of, you have all of these creators now, right? Okay, so if you think about podcasting when it first started, people who started their podcast back then, they dominated the field because those shows, especially if they're still running today, are well known, right? Those people are they've built their brand. They are your, Tom Bilyeu, or I don't know how to say that guy's name, Jenna Kutcher, Amy Porterfield, like, all of these different creators, Lori Harder, like these are the shows that I listened to when I first got into podcasting. And it's amazing, but it's like, it's very hard to now today, in the way that today's market is, to position yourself in the same way. And I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying it's not as easy as it was before, because those people have paved their way through the space. And what I think people forget, and especially when it comes to podcasting, and it drives me absolutely bananas, people forget that it takes time. Podcasting is not an overnight success. You're not just going to launch a show and then become instantly famous. Like, I've worked with different people, some celebrities, some people who are massive in their spaces, and you would be shocked at their downloads. They don't convert in the same way that you think that they do, because podcasting is that long game. Podcasting is, creating your content week over week and showing up and being committed to your message, being committed to the audience that you are honoring, and just being present in what you're doing. I don't know what you think about that, but I feel like people have this false idea. I'm going to launch a podcast. I'm going to become famous. I'm going to get all this money and I'm going to monetize my show. But again, it's like setting those expectations and then also being realistic about, who you are in the space and what you're doing in the space.
Yeah, like I love what you just said. Let me add two things. One,
Please.
the worry that I get all the time, I was like, why is this a worry? People are like, oh my God, the celebrity, whatever, is launching a podcast in my field. Ah, she's going to
Okay.
steal all my downloads. If you look at the amount of celebrities that launch a podcast and do it for a year, and then they only did it for the money, they don't like the medium, they're literally just doing it for like money in their account, because it's like, okay, it's a new brand, like I'm gonna get sponsorship money, blah blah blah. Like they come in and they go, right? Like whatever.
Hmm.
But people get super territorial. I'm like, you don't complain on social media, you may even follow that person, like so
Right.
why are you getting territorial in the podcast world? But so I think it's ridiculous. If this has been a worry in your mind, just drop that. Like look at the amount of celebrities that have like kept a podcast going. Very few. The ones that
Mm.
actually love the medium are the ones that stay. And what you
Mm-hmm.
said about like the Amy Porterfield and
Yeah,
all
yeah.
the other people, it if you are an early adopter, this is actually a lesson for people. Early adopters are always benefited in the long term because it's cumulative. Like if you look on YouTube, the bigger YouTube people that like were that started in the beginning of the platform, they invested their time and a lot of money, a lot of them, to be where they are today. They spent years probably being made fun of, like, oh my god, you're like making videos on your basement, like what the hell. And like these people persevere through time, and like and again, we later in the season we'll talk about like exactly how to overcome like these like waves of like excitement, and then maybe you're feeling
Mm-hmm.
down, all of that. But I think that people forget that, yeah, like it takes a lot of time, but also like you sometimes have to take a leap of faith and try a platform before everyone else does. And I
Mm-hmm.
know of a lot of people who say, I want to start a podcast. No one else in my industry is doing this, but I am so afraid of the judgment that I'll get from the like more established people in my industry, because who am I to start a podcast? And I'm like,
Yeah.
oh my god, it's important, you see the value, but like you don't have like the confidence to do it. So I feel like there's also that element. You have to believe you are a trendsetter in order to make podcasting work and make it work for the long run, because there's so many people who are trying something new and they just like get so disappointed because it didn't work. And I saw these LinkedIn posts somewhere about like maybe the thing you're doing isn't converting yet or isn't working yet because you're a trendsetter and you're ahead of everybody. But once
Mm.
things start, once the industry or once the economy catches up, you will have a legacy of content that you can show people. And I was like, oh, that's great,
I love that.
right?
I love that. That is so great. That is so great. And I think that key piece of just continuing and just keep going and just keep trying, but doing it in a way that feels aligned for you and making sure that when you are doing it, you know why you're doing it. You know what I mean? And if it doesn't feel good for you anymore, don't do it. I think it's really important that when we're creating, because there's been times in my life when I've created content and I'm like, oh my god, I don't want to show up for this right now, and I know I need to because I have to do it, because I have to get something out there, because I haven't been online in like 3 weeks, and I'm like, oh my god. And it's like you put something out and like there are those moments too, But I think when you think about the bigger picture and like the holistic idea of what your message is, it becomes inevitable to continue on, and you get excited to do that. And I want to ask you, because we're going to be talking a little bit more, the next few episodes are a little bit more like nitty gritty in terms of like, specifics and analytics and like that kind of stuff. I want to ask you, you mentioned some tips to help you sort of reframe that mindset. So could you share some of them before we wrap up today's episode?
Well, I'll start with probably one of the most important one. Drop the and this is like strong one, but drop the fake it until you make it. I hate this expression because most people look at it from the and I have a podcast episode on this. So basically, it talks about how the fake it until you make it assumes that where you are isn't worth it of sharing. You're not worthy. You have to pretend that you're someone else. And that's the thing. People don't look at it from like, I'm going to act as if I already have 1,000 downloads and show up in an amazing way to my audience. This is not how anyone sees that. Is where I am sucks. Where I am is not enough. Where I am means nothing in terms of my growth. And the messy middle, people love that stuff because not enough people talk about it. And so
Mm-hmm.
even if your show has, a lot of downloads that you think like, okay, so and so has a ton of downloads and I'm like way behind. Show up as your best self. Like, think about it. I already have, 1 million downloads per month. Think about it like that. How would I personally show up as that person? Instead of thinking, how is Amy Porterfield showing up and mimicking what she's doing? Because I'll tell you, Amy has a producer who actually writes scripts. She has a team that develops concepts, that is looking at analytics, that is doing her videos, that is like, she had probably a lot of coaches on how to deliver content. She did all of this. And you look at where you are. You're a small business owner. You probably are either podcasting yourself and doing all the things yourself, or you have a small team that you're paying someone to do that for you.
Mm-hmm.
These are different scales. And so stop looking
Yeah.
at the outcome as like, I can do it. It's unrealistic. And so start looking around at the people that are doing about the same level or just slightly ahead and see what is the quality they put out. What are they putting out? What are they talking about? And they're getting engagement. So you should feel confident doing the same thing because that's like the progress. As you are documenting your progress, that is the best way to showcase your growth because you will
Mm-hmm.
go, do replays or whatever, and you look back and I'm like, oh my god, like I maybe at the time only had like an itty bitty webcam, or I only did only, and like 2 years now I have like a really good camera, and maybe I'm more confident. Just your own confidence, or the
Yeah.
guests, the quality of guests you are now interviewing, your dream guests. All of these things are possible, but you have to appreciate the presence, like the present. Like, I have 10 people every week that kind of reach out to me. I'm like not disappointed, or 5 or whatever. And I'm like looking, like it fluctuates. And I'm like, I'm getting feedback on my podcast. And I treat those listeners as rock stars. I'm like, thank you so much for listening. And thank you for your email. It was great. I appreciate you sharing your experience and sharing what you've learned and what you took out of it. Tell me how it goes. If you're not nurturing what you have right now, it's almost like telling the universe that you're like, I don't want any of this, because you're just not appreciative of any of that.
Yeah.
So that is, to me, the one tip that I think is important to understand. Where you are is valid. Look around. How many people are actually podcasting in your industry, in your life,
Mm-hmm.
in your circle of
Mm-hmm.
friends? Probably not that
Mm-hmm.
many people. So you are
Mm-hmm.
a trendsetter, whether you see it or not. That's what I'd say.
I love that. I love that. Anna, thank you so much for joining me on the very first episode of our series together. I'm so excited for the next 3 and to dive in even further and to learn more from you and to talk more nitty-gritty and more specifics. I think you're amazing. So thank you for joining me today.
Right back at you. Thank you. And I'm hoping that the listeners having already like 3 pages of like notes.
I know, me too. And if you're not, go back and start again. No, I'm
Yes.
just kidding. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of As It Relates to Podcasting with my guest, Anna. All of her links can be found in the show notes below. Be sure to connect with her on social media. Say hello and connect with me so that I know what you loved from this conversation today. Thanks again so much. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe the show and share it with another creator that you know needs this help today. Okay, I'll see you on the flip side.